Hey, welcome back to the Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here with a new friend who has a lot in common with my life growing up, and we could get into it. Y'all know that I've done a lot in the microbiome, but I was kind of microbiome adjacent, doing the film and doing, the stories on it. These guys live it. So Afif Ghannoum is the CEO of a company that's doing some amazing work. His dad and I had talked about, some of the diagnostics and, kind of on the academic side of this spectrum. The science behind the microbiome is fascinating, and I'm honored to have my friend Afif on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to see you, man. Great to see you. So the microbiome, big topic. I mean, obviously, interconnected was, 10-part series that seemed, like a pretty deep dive into it. And what, my audience didn't know was, in 10 hours, 10 plus hours, probably like 15 hours of edited footage, we were still just scratching the surface.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it is so big. There are all of the kind of immunology departments at the universities that we were interviewing at were turning into microbiology departments and just saying, look, we can't even look at immunology without understanding the microbiome. So, first off, let's just talk about what got you and your dad into this, because, it's fascinating. And I think a lot of people are into it for different reasons. I just want to know your pathway in.
Totally. So since my father's been a microbiologist since 1976 when he got his PhD, and his PhD was literally in the role Canada played when antibiotics were applied in rabbit models. And what they would see was when they removed all the bacteria, Canada would overgrow. And really, since that time, he's really looked at the interaction of mostly bacteria and fungi with each other and how it affects all of our wellness. So fast forward, a few decades, he got into biofilm research, which, some people have heard of the term biofilm, but some don't. The analogy I always use is the biofilm everyone's familiar with is dental plaque. And plaques are biofilms. So all they're doing is, creating almost a shield over a part of the body. So for example, your teeth, and what's going on underneath is they're causing issues with the teeth, your gums. And he discovered the same thing happening in the GI when he did an NIH clinical trial looking at the microbiome of Crohn's patients in 2016. So he had been doing a lot of microbiome research. 2010, he actually identified 101 native fungal organisms living in the oral cavity, and he coined the term the mycobiome for fungal community, which is now widely used as the term meaning fungi in the body. So fast forward to 2016, he's doing this clinical trial, and what he found was that, the biofilms had been known a long time, but what had not been known was that bacteria and fungi were actually working together collaboratively. So when he was looking at bacteria biofilms, they're like this big, fungal biofilms, same size. Bacterial fungal biofilms were significantly bigger. So it was this wild, discovery that, Scientific America, a lot of people covered that, these inter-kingdom cooperation in the gut was causing serious issues for Crohn's patients. So what happened is that research got a lot of play. And so a woman in Sweden reached out to him and basically said, like, my two sons are basically wasting away from Crohn's, could you test them? And it was like really funny to us that he was doing all this NIH research. He was doing all this, sort of ivory tower, heavy duty science, but this poor woman could not practically access that science. And we thought, that really doesn't make sense. And then the other thing we noticed was no one was really talking about the role of fungi and biofilms in gut health. So we launched, Biome, and that's really, I'm a biotech attorney by background. So since 2008, he and I have been sort of taking his academic science and turning it into products. We created a dry mouth brand that you and I have talked about a little bit offline. One of the big global pharma companies licensed that. So anything to do with germs, we kind of look and we're like, okay, well, the scientific applications, how can we make that accessible to consumers? Because you're right, like the science is so fascinating and deep, but it's also very overwhelming, to understand what to do. So that's how we got into it. And, it's ever since then, it's just figuring out, okay, well, how do you keep making this accessible?
Well, that's it. And look, I mean, there are fungi out there that we obviously know and understand and know of interactions. I mean, the famous one being penicillin coming from mold and creating antibiotics and probably, saving, changing the course of World War One, and two, arguably. Since then, I mean, I think the only one that's, I couldn't call any of these a household term, but like Saccharomyces boulardii, which is, a fungal agent that is very supportive of, some of the microbiome. It's in a lot of the supplements, and it's, in the research and all that. But I mean, that's really it. So the real question is, fungus got here first, right? That's the ancient kingdom, and then plants and bacteria and all these things showed up later. We showed up way later. What are we finding in terms of push and pull? What are we finding in terms of the synergies and the symbiosis of some of these? Because I know it's super complicated.
Incredibly complicated. So there's a couple of things I'd say. One, a lot of times people will say, well, there's definitely bacteria and fungi in the gut, but there's a lot more bacteria than there are fungi. And my dad has a slide he loves showing. I'll send it to you. And it's a 10,000x magnification, and it shows Candida, and it's about this big. And all around it are these little guys that are the bacteria, So that's really what is really misunderstood, is that fungi is about 10x the size of bacteria in the GI. And when you look at that picture, what you actually see, going back to where we were talking about the biofilms, is you see hyphae actually fusing together. So there's this really collaborative process happening in the gut. It's not just like we always think about, and we talk about good germs, bad germs. That's really not the right way to look at it in our view. What you have to look at it is very much more like sharks in the ocean. Like you wouldn't want to be in a pool with sharks, but if you remove sharks from the ocean's ecosystem, you're going to have serious ramifications in the whole overall ecosystem. They have a very important role to play. Same with fungi, same with even Candida. Candida is one that a lot of people talk about. We test for Candida, and a lot of people get freaked out when they say, oh my God, I have Candida in the gut. 40% of us are normal holders of Candida in our GI. It's very normal, and actually in low levels, it's actually very helpful for digestion, nutrient absorption. The problem is with these fungi that are considered like bad guys, is if they do grow out of control, they can have serious ramifications. That's where you have thrush. One of our favorite stories is we had this, because we have a microbiome gut test. And we had this cluster of women that were showing very high overgrowth of this fungi called zygomycota. And my dad typically would only see it in highly autoimmune situations like cancer patients, HIV patients, but it was enough of a cluster that we thought, that seems unlikely that it would be this many undiagnosed. And when we looked at their diet, completely cutting out carbs, completely cutting out dairy. And so what was wild was that this fungi that you typically only see grow out of control with someone with an serious autoimmune disorder was growing out of control because people were taking out these very microbiome friendly foods. Now, again, the problem with this whole thing, it's not binary, right? Because when I'll say that, a lot of people say, well, wait a second, dairy's, you don't want to have too much dairy, or, I have an issue with gluten. Well, yeah, of course. But the microbiome is a series of levers, is the way, you look at it. You don't want to be trying to eliminate anything. You don't want to be, in our opinion, cutting anything just to do it. So that's where it gets really interesting.
The series of levers part is really inconvenient, because the way the current healthcare model is set up is, okay, tell me what to do. Give me a pill. You said dairy. It's way too binary. You said dairy was bad. Now you're saying dairy is good. What's the answer? Is it God or the devil? And it's not how it's supposed to work. But the problem is, you can't make a recommendation without understanding what's going on in an individual ecosystem, right? And so let's talk about testing. Let's talk about where testing has gone, what we can reasonably ascertain at this stage of the science, because there's a lot of hyperbole out there, right? There's also there's a lot of stuff that shouldn't be said.
100%. So testing and supplements. Let me touch on it for a second, because you said a critical thing. A lot of people talk, well, especially when they'll take our test or even just reach out and say, which product should I take? And we say, listen, probiotics, like any dietary supplement, should be a supplement to what you're doing with your diet, what you're doing with your lifestyle, because it's multifactorial. Like we've had people that eat perfectly, they exercise great, but they are so stressed from work that they have terrible digestive issues, right? So the problem is you cannot look at any of these things in isolation. So with the testing, the way we look at microbiome testing, and this is why, we just announced a big partnership with Standard Process, like we're doing a lot of things in academic medicine now, is because when we go in, we talk about microbiome as being a tool that will give you additional insights among a number of insights. And then you can start making decisions. I think, the concern, and for us, it doesn't help us as a company if people get the impression that, oh, all I have to do is take a test and my issues are going to be solved. Now I'm going to know which boxes to check. It doesn't work that way. What it is it's extra insight. The analogy I use is it's like a cholesterol test, right? If I say, oh, you're 200 cholesterol level, and you go, okay, what should I do? I don't know. Do you eat pizza every day? Do you have family history? But it's a critically important litmus test, so you can understand where you're at. Now, with microbiome health, the very frustrating thing for a lot of people with digestive issues is you don't know what is causing it. It's not like inner ear ringing or something very acute that you can like siphon in, like, oh, the crystals in your ears are off or something like that. You can have digestive issues for probably 1,000 different reasons, right? But what a microbiome test can do is to start to remove some of the layers of the onion so you can understand, are there certain organisms that are out of whack? Okay, if they are, why is that? Is it related to some health issue I have? Is it related to my diet? Is it related to a medication? A lot of people don't realize how many medications can cause microbiome issues, right? So it gives you insights to then go from. Now on the reverse, and it's funny, we used to have a Candida test. We actually discontinued it. The reason being, people would get so frustrated when they tested negative for Candida.
Because I swear I have it. I have all the symptoms.
People would get angry, and we'd say, we're not going to tell you if you don't have it, and that's one of the things, like, we take deadly serious. Every one of our tests is actually processed at Case Western School of Medicine in my father's lab. We basically just consumerize his NIH science, so that's the part about microbiome testing, is it can tell you and lead you to potential things to look at, but it can also say, you know what, it likely isn't your microbiome. Look elsewhere,
Yeah, it's the ecological models that kind of came over. I think, one of the things that I gleaned, having done, spent 18 months of my life looking at this science, was, the way we were looking at it was an antiquated form of kind of linear binary science. Whereas, it's like you use the shark model, but, another, common examples, kind of the wolves in Yellowstone, is how do you look at the gross ecology of this person, which is an ecosystem, and how do you adjust for it in ways that are nuanced and not just saying, well, it turns out you have Candida, here's how you bomb it, and now it's over, right? And we saw, God, I mean, I'm sure you see a gajillion examples of this, but just SIGA numbers going up and down with stressors, hormone levels shifting, throughout a woman's cycle and creating a different ecosystem on a monthly. So depending on when you actually did the test, there was a subtle ecology, or you had a little bit of sugar with dessert last night, and literally the test that you took is not a good sampling of your 30-day average of what this ecology looks like. And so how does one adjust? I mean, because it's such a moving target, how does one adjust the therapeutics around it?
That's a great question. So the first thing that we do to try and isolate for what you're talking about is we identify and we report on what we call basically the 60 core organisms in the GI. So if it's in your gut, we will see it. This isn't like what's called PCR testing, where a lot of tests, not just in microbiome, but when you're looking for an organism like a Candida, you'll do something called a PCR test where we're specifically looking for that organism. If it's there, we'll tell you what it is and the levels. In microbiome testing, we're doing 16S, ITS for the fungi. If it's in your gut, we're seeing it. Now, to your point, a lot of these organisms are what we call transitory, right? They're not native to the GI, and they'll be here today, gone tomorrow, elevated today, normal tomorrow. So what we're looking for are about 60 organisms that there is a tremendous amount of science tied to their, not only tied to health and wellness, but what their residency in the GI has to do. Otherwise, honestly, the insights start to be very difficult to glean from. The example I also like to use is viruses, because a lot of people say, oh, but aren't there viruses in the gut too? There are, but there's two issues with reporting on viruses. And again, in our opinion, one, as it stands, the ability to reliably and consistently detect viruses in the GI and report the levels, the science is not there, the technology is not there, unlike bacteria and fungi. And we can talk about why that is, NIH funding and all that. So that's an issue. Like, if we can't reliably report it, it's not worth doing. The other is the science is so light on viruses' roles in the microbiome that we don't think it's worth really getting into. There's enough to unpack with bacteria and fungi. Now, you and I have talked offline about metabolomics and short chain fatty acids, all these other things coming from it. But again, I think the way to look at it for most people, vast majority of people, is really an 80-20 rule. Is that microbiome test is going to give you a good indicator of things you need to look at. But again, the analogy I like to use is, we've all been stuck in traffic behind the guy on the carbon fiber bike, Lycra suit, amazing helmet, but he's 80 pounds overweight. And it's like, the carbon fiber bike, the Lycra suit, those efficiencies are nothing compared to if you lost weight for you to go better on a bike, right? But we see in microbiome testing, the vast majority of people, it's not a little bit of very nuanced change they need to make. They're pretty obvious things when you look at them. Like, they're reporting eating fast food once a week. They're reporting eating a ton of red meat. They're not eating a lot of plants and vegetables. They're eating a ton of fruit, which can cause issues with Canada. So a lot of these changes, it really comes down to 80-20. Now, we'll also deal with like Olympians, UFC guys, that sort of thing, where they really are looking for that additional edge. But even with them, a lot of times, like my buddy Kyle Kingsbury, he's down with a former UFC champion. You look at the guy, he's cut out of marble, right? Like, this is a premier elite athlete. He was putting so much stress on his body from exercise. It was causing GI issues, right? So like, that can happen too, where it seems like there's not much more you can do, but sometimes, like you and I were in it a lot, that it's like, okay, you know what, for you, it's likely not your diet. It's not likely not medication. It's likely this level of stress you're putting physically on your body,
So Marty Blazer, one of the kind of elder statesmen of this work, and he kind of looked at the poop samples of natives who had been exposed to our world, and one of the kind of dominant theories that came out early days was these guys have amazing variety with thousands and thousands of species, and the standard American diet is killing that, and we've got very little variety, which could allude to less resilience and more kind of sensitivity of the immune system and all that. How, and again, I made this film a couple years ago. Catch me up on where the science is on that and whether that theory is still kind of leading.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is self-fulfilling and it's dead on. I'll give you an example. We did a clinical trial on people with autism and their microbiome. And what we compared was autistic children and a sibling that was non-autistic. Now, this is kind of interesting to why microbiome is so complex. Why siblings? Because they're not only genetically related, but they're also eating a lot of times in the same household. So they're having a similar diet. So we're trying to isolate what the condition is doing with the microbiome. And what we saw were, with statistical significance, big differences. We're actually publishing a paper right now between the GI of a child with autism and a child without. Now, this is where it gets nuanced, right? Because the simple conclusion is, oh, wow, autism must be tied, autism's either causing microbiome balance, and microbiome balance maybe causing. But the nuance there is that a lot of times children with autism are very specific with their diet. Mm-hmm. And it can be very like carb heavy, like be very bland. And that, the theory is that might actually be causing the microbiome dysbiosis and causing the lack of diversity. Why? Because it's like kind of heavy American diet, right? So again, what you're talking about, going back to like, uncontacted tribes, basically, we're seeing it, and you can see it isolated in situations like this, like where we're looking at autism, where there's a very, heavy duty dietary element, where diversity is completely off, because while the average American is not very diverse, you're talking about an even more hyper version of that when it comes to autism. So yeah, it's a lot of, going back to the 80-20 rule, a lot of differences can be made with just some simple adjustments, and the boring answer is, it's not stuff a lot of people have not heard before, right? Like, one of my favorite things I'm going to butcher is like, if we just did what we know, we'd all be billionaires with six packs. You know what I mean? Like, it's things that, it's not like some Amazonian fruit people need to be ingesting. It's like plant-based diet, if you're going to do, meats, lean proteins, and you're going to be doing a lot to get yourself to where you need to be. That's not what we're typically doing, though, with Americanized diet.
Well, that's it. So one of the things that kind of came out, and something I do with my kids all the time, and knock wood, they're healthy kids, is we have a colored food chart on the refrigerator, and we basically say, look, you need 2 different colors of a fruit or vegetable with every meal. What did you get? What was it? And we just kind of gamify it with the kids. Would love to see, what other kind of simple recommendations and remedies you have for that. And while you do that, I'm gonna cut my camera. My camera's kind of tripping out, so I'm gonna switch cameras while you're answering. I'm right here, but I'm just gonna switch cameras while you answer that.
Yeah. So honestly, it's not overthinking a lot of these things. My dad always talks about layering in and defaulting towards prebiotic heavy foods, things like sweet potatoes, like slightly green bananas, things that are really going to build that sort of ecosystem in the gut, green leafy vegetables. Why? Because, and this is an area I'm happy to talk about, but we talk a lot about probiotics in the GI, but we really don't talk about what causes, optimal growth of probiotics, what causes optimal control of negative organisms. And that's really fostering a prebiotic friendly environment in the GI. So really, like, centering towards, again, things that you hit the nail on the head. If you're having a colorful plant-based diet, that's going to be super productive. The other thing is cutting down on fruit. Fruit, we found, we're actually going to be publishing some data coming up, that with statistical significance, if you have at least 2 cups of fruits a day, you are statistically more likely to have Candida overgrowth, right? Again, people have heard this about fruit, but it seems counterintuitive when you say this, because fruit seems pretty healthy, right? But it's again, the problem is, and honestly, sometimes I feel sorry for when people are trying to navigate this, because, like you said, you're kind of damned if you do, down if you don't. Like, and the problem is, it's breaking it down to, like, we've now heard over the last probably decade about sugar's role in causing obesity and all these sorts of things. But again, when you bring down fruit, tons of sugar in fruit just naturally, right? So limiting some of these things are going to be key. But honestly, we really are big advocates of a prebiotic heavy diet.
You, sorry, you broke up at the very end there. Yeah, advocates of a prebiotic heavy diet. Now, foods, I know Jerusalem artichoke, there are, I know there's like a list of prebiotic heavy foods that, like, what is it? Like cooled down rice, once cooled rice. There's green bananas. What else is there that the kids will actually eat?
Sweet potatoes are a big one. And honestly, like, the easiest thing to do, because the beauty of our age now is it's not hard to find this information. I literally Google, like, prebiotic ingredients. Actually, on our site, we have a whole grocery list of microbiome friendly ingredients that people can infuse into their grocery list. So it's really just, literally, if you Google it, there's going to be a ton of different ones. You do not have to get exotic. It's literally like the sweet potatoes of the world. Like you said, Jerusalem artichoke. One of the things my dad really likes is apple cider vinegar, because it's got really strong biofilm activity. So again, not overkill, just like adding it to salad dressings. But yeah, we're big advocates of actually keeping it pretty simple. You really don't have to get exotic.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people, I left LA a few years ago, but I mean, every time someone gained 5 pounds, they do a cleanse. You know what I mean? And it was just like everyone's doing all this crazy over the top stuff because, it's gotten popularized in the media. I ran out of things to say, right? And it's what you do every day that really counts, obviously.
Well, you hit the nail on the head about the cleanse thing. This blew my mind. So we, dealing with our manufacturer, we actually have a colon cleanse, and they told us that the average American who buys a colon cleanse uses it on almost a nightly basis, which you should not be doing because
that's a laxative. That's not a cleanse.
It's literally a laxative, right? So the problem is people, again, even though they're trying to do it through supplementation, it's still this idea that, a pill can fix this. And really, like, if you're doing that, it's because you're not keeping the system going. And the other thing, and I always like to mention it because we've seen this be a real issue, is people will try and do these things. They'll try and do a lot more plant-based, and they'll start feeling like bloated or uncomfortable, and they'll say, "Oh, it just doesn't work for my system. It must be something else." And the reality is, your body's just gotten rid of these enzymes, so it's really adjusting to being able to efficiently break it down. Producing extra gas, it's making it really uncomfortable. But if you stick through it for a couple of weeks, that starts to ease, and then honestly, you start to see the regularity. So that's something I always like to mention because it can feel really uncomfortable when you make big adjustments, but it makes sense because honestly, for a lot of people, it's probably decades of not eating enough fruits and vegetables. It was something like the average 40-year-old man, I just turned 40, needs something like 40 grams of fiber a day. And we're getting like 8 grams of fiber a day. You know what I mean? So we're nowhere like close on what we should be getting just to keep your system kind of moving.
Yeah. And I mean, that's nothing a pill is going to, I mean, if you're looking for pills and invasive remedies to take care of, the food that you're supposed to be putting in your mouth every day, then you are on the wrong side of the allopathic equation, right? Like that's why everyone's taking these colonoscopies and getting the polyps out. And there's a lot of reasons why this industry is as big as it is. And it starts with, not just the grocery store, but what makes it into the meals. Ashley has a question here. Would it be good to test multiple times a year for broader picture of our microbiome? Like what's the appropriate cadence on this?
That's a great question. So we do have people do that. Every 6 months is about enough. The reason why is the fungi in your gut can actually, there's a lot of science showing that can actually change almost overnight, like 24 hours, you can start to see fungi adjust. Bacteria is actually pretty difficult to adjust in the GI. So doing it any more than maybe maximum once a quarter, but I personally think that's a little overkill. I think you can do it a couple times a year and you're going to get a really, good picture because it's a little bit like adjusting, a tanker ship, right? When you're doing these things, it's going to take a minute to see adjustments. And frankly, sometimes the adjustments you initially make are really not what's going to make the adjustment. So I honestly think a couple times a year is probably about right.
Okay. That's good to hear. And that's also part of it too, is, when you turn the wheel on the tanker, you're probably going to have to wait 8 minutes to see, the front of the boat turn. And so, starting to eat vegetables isn't going to suddenly make you a super pooper and everything, day one, right? Just, you got to I think what's happened particularly in the patient population in America is people have been trained to expect instant results. And that's not necessarily how things with diet work, right? It just takes a minute. Drink more water, eat more fiber, let the body adjust. It takes a couple weeks.
In fact, the first couple of weeks, it's uncomfortable and you feel gross most of the time because your body is just like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? So that's I think where the frustration can set in. Like, am I doing it right? And again, going back to like why I do think a test can be helpful is it's not always your microbiome. It can be as simple as, honestly, the medication you're taking, it might be having issues with regularity. It might not actually be a microbiome issue, So I think that's one of the main reasons I actually like recommending is understanding whether it's actually the issue or not.
What are some of the common culprits that you guys are finding in your testing that are throwing the microbiome that people wouldn't necessarily suspect?
The number one issue by far is stress, right? So a lot of people, like, we have this it's almost internally like a little bit of a cliche now, where you have these people, because again, if you're taking a test, you're probably a pretty motivated person through one of two things. You're dealing with digestive issues, or you're what we call an optimizer, right? Like you eat really well, you're trying to actually get that next level of health. And so a lot of people will come and they are really trying to eat well. They are exercising, they're doing, but they're exceedingly stressed. So that seems like very like new age to say sometimes, but the science is there that if you actively work on lowering your stress, it can have a huge impact on microbiome. Another one that it's just part of American culture is alcohol. Alcohol is a big culprit in microbiome imbalance. Genetics does play an issue, but we've seen people fall into a couple buckets. One, they usually don't even know it's an issue unless they're actually having digestive issues that they're sort of prone. The example I use is, everyone has that uncle that goes to the dentist once a decade and has never had a cavity, and then the aunt who goes once a quarter and she's constantly getting root canals. And it's just genetically, you can have healthier microbiome or not. So then honestly, outside of lifestyle, like stress, sleep is important. A lot of it is diet. We see a lot of people that they swear they've tried everything, but when they're doing the questionnaire, they're eating fast food once a week. You know what I mean? And they may think, oh, but it's healthy sandwich, or I'm good. No, there's a lot of processed foods in those things that are prepared, even if they're quote unquote healthier, quick, fast food. I'm thinking of a term like for the Chipotles of the world. Like there's a lot of preservative things that are causing issues with microbiota that people just don't, think about. So those are the main issues.
It's interesting is, people think of the word preservative. It's kind of just like a shop word that's like, oh, that's what preserves food. But what are you preserving food from is bacterial overgrowth. So these are oftentimes cidal agents that are designed to keep bacteria from growing. But if you eat them, what do they do in your gut? Right? They kill the things that are supposed to thrive in your gut. And listen, no one wants E. coli, right? And so there's a trade-off there with kind of public health and safety, and having a healthy microbiome. And that I think that balance is still yet to be struck in our food service industry. But there are a number of interesting conversations happening around that, as I'm sure you're in the middle of here.
Yeah, and again, it's a lot of times people think of it as like global food, or like there's and it's like, no, listen, I sell products. I've sold products at retail. One of the first questions the retailer will ask you is like, how long will this last on my shelf, right? Because by the time it gets to distribution, so like these preservatives a lot of times are just the nature of buying things at mass market retailers, right? So the more you can do, and that's fine. I'm a big reasonable advocate, right? It's not realistic, I think, to cut out all of this stuff, but there's thoughtful things you can do along the way, right? If you're trying to eat from local markets, if you're trying to eat from local providers, a lot less of those things are going to be in the supply chain versus if you're buying from mega brands for everything, right? Because if it's on the shelf, and rule of thumb, they need that thing to be on the shelf 1 to 2 years to make it economical. That's how they make it go, make it last.
Yeah, take an apple and put it on your shelf for 2 years and tell me what you see. Right? That's not how nature works, right? Nature decomposes very rapidly, and that's what bacteria do to help decompose. And it becomes, a major issue when it comes to delivering food safely to humans. And I understand the other side of it is just,
right.
Every time there's some sort of recall, there's millions of dollars, and you got blood on your hands. As a food producer, you don't want that, right? Like there are some real serious consequences to poisoning humans that food growers and suppliers are also very cognizant of, right?
You're even seeing it, and if I might be wrong, I've never heard, at least in the last 10 to 20 years, of a food poisoning outbreak at like a major burger chain. But you heard about it in the Chipotles of the world. Why? Because they're trying to keep it very natural. They're trying, but that comes with risks, right? And so that's how you get an E. coli outbreak. So again, you kind of, but again, these things exist because there's big demand for them, right? If people were asking for these things preservative free, there's always a way to figure things out. But No, like they'll keep selling it until people stop wanting it, you know?
That's it. Well, and listen, when I'm driving from Phoenix to California or something, I'm gonna get hungry,
Right.
and once in a while I got to eat that stuff. But if that's my everyday, it's a lot bigger of a challenge, right?
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head. The other thing we talk about a lot is we're big advocates of, even if you're doing this in eating right 80% of the time, that's okay, because guess what? You're likely going to stick with that. Doing 100% of something that you're going to do for 4 days is kind of useless, you know? So I think the problem is it goes back to what we were saying about this idea of binary. You must be doing this or you're doing awful. And we just don't think that's honestly practical for the vast majority of people. And honestly, it's not necessary. It's like a lot of people ask, oh, well, nutrition, like, are you guys developing products for each individual person? What we've seen is that people fall into one of, less than a dozen typical microbiome profiles, right? There really is not that much variation person to person. So honestly, it's overkill to be doing it down to that level of detail. So I think it's the same, honestly, with diet. Is if you're doing a lot of these things, they are going to add up. It's like exercise, right? Like, you don't have to be running a marathon every day, but if you're doing 25 minutes of exercise daily, 5 days a week, it's going to add up. It's very much the same with microbiome.
Yeah, love that. One more question, and then I have one more question on the way out. Ashley's asking, curious, I'm a whole food plant-based, but I have 1 tablespoon of maple syrup in my 2 cups of coffee every day. So two tablespoons of maple syrup per day. Could that small amount of sugar cause significant disruption in the gut?
So the short answer is it's possible. I would not get worked up about that, because, to be honest, you're being very thoughtful when you're doing that. I would much rather see someone have a regular soda once in a while than a diet soda, because they're trying to avoid, the sugar. That's not the way to look at it, because if that, couple tablespoons or teaspoons of maple syrup keeps you eating, like you said, whole plant based, otherwise, I think that's great. Now, if you started having issues, you got to look, and that would be the first thing that I'd say. Okay, well, that's obviously a high source of sugar, and maybe it's worth taking out. But that's the way you really need to look at it. I think if you're so hyper disciplined and not doing that in reaction to something, then you might be causing yourself more harm than good. It's again going back to when I told you that carbs and dairy is being cut out. We'll get a lot of people say, I have issues with gluten. Are you saying I should have carbs? I'm like, no, we're not saying that at all. For you, that's an issue, right? So you have to address it, right? So you can compensate in other ways. So again, it's very individualistic on what makes sense for you. I'm a big advocate of, these things are great sort of rails to consider, but don't be so dogmatic that you're taking away this thing that you like to do every day just because something you read somewhere it's not necessarily great for you.
Yeah, love that. Okay, I got one more question. We get a little bit of warble in your video, so I want to make sure I can get this question off, and then we'll kind of cut out from here. And for those of you who are here watching on YouTube or Facebook, we're going to start kind of tripling down and doing Clubhouse, YouTube, and Facebook simultaneously. We're trying to put all of our technology together, but the Clubhouse recording will be really, superior for audio. My last question here, Afif, is there is some interesting news coming out showing some significant neurological and psychological fallout from a significant percentage of people who were infected with the COVID virus. Are you guys looking at or seeing any sort of involvement with the microbiome that would be potentially implicit in some of this?
So we are actually doing a big retroactive analysis of pre-COVID and COVID on a couple of different fronts. One, there's obviously a lot of literature showing that there are ties between the two, and microbiome health is actually potentially indicative of infection rates. But the other thing we're looking at is how microbiota has adjusted related to stress pre-COVID and COVID, because we think that's obviously going to be a factor that's just been elevated stress all around. So yeah, we are looking, but honestly, it's just now getting to the point where the data is significant enough to really do a what we, statistically significant analysis of that data. But yeah, there's going to, you watch the next year, there's going to be a lot of studies coming out about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I have yet to see something that didn't have some sort of microbiome tie-in in the last several years. Just curious. And that's something that I'd love to invite you back on as soon as the data starts kind of trickling in, because there are things that we can do, right? There are elements within our control that, will have dramatic outcome variance, right? Whether, you're going to end up with an anxiety disorder after contracting this thing, or, worse, there's some serious neurological disorders that some people are reporting coming out of this infection. So tell us about Biome, tell us about the work that you're doing, tell us how people can find you and your father's work.
Yeah, so the easiest way is biohmhealth.com, which is just BioHM Health.com. And then on the social media channels, just at BioHM Health. And they can see all of our information. So basically what we've done is our whole foundation was creating probiotics based on breaking down digestive biofilm. And so what we did is called correlation analysis, where we look for these very aggressive bacteria and fungi that were showing up in that multi-kingdom biofilm. And we said, okay, well, what probiotic organisms can we find and enzymes that will actually shred that? And so we did that and filed a lot of IP around that, but that became the genesis of Biome. So we've got everything from super greens and super reds infused with Biome probiotics to, capsules and prebiotics. More and more, everything we're producing is based on what we're seeing in the data and how to optimally create microbiome products. And then obviously, as we've been talking about, we do have microbiome tests. One of the things we're really proud of is that every single test is actually processed at Case Western School of Medicine, which is one of the top 25 academic medical institutions in the US. And I think that's important because at the end of the day, this is pharma grade testing you're talking about, so for us, we thought it made sense just to keep it at an academic medical institution. So yeah, and it's fun to work with my dad every day. It's he's my best friend, and it's just cool to see his science come out of sort of the ivory tower of academia into people's living rooms.
It's a great unique situation too, because you got the ivory tower doctor who's just kind of spinning out all sorts of really cool relevant information, and a guy our age in the form of you that can actually make it accessible to the world faster than that, say, 20-year arc that it takes for some of this data to get to market, right? Like it just takes forever, right?
Yeah.
Is the test available? Who can get the test? Is the test available like only in the States, or what's the deal with it?
So the test is in the United States, and they can if they do just Biome Health, and they'll see it on our product page. And we are doing some really cool partnerships. More and more, we're actually powering other microbiome platforms, like company Standard Process, one of the biggest practitioner companies out there. They've launched a microbiome test powered by Biome because again, everything we do is how can we sort of further the science in academia. So that's the easiest way. If they go to a practitioner that has Standard Process, or they can obviously get it off of our site too.
Love it. And as we get more evidence on some of these studies on some of this COVID fallout, we'll come back and share that as well. It's just very early, so I don't want to, you don't want to speak out of turn. You want to do good science, and so let's figure out what's going on, and then we'll report back on it.
And the last thing I'll tell people is be very wary of correlation, meaning causation. All the time in the microbiome, like literally I have an alert, there's a microbiome study almost every day. Just because there's some correlation, going back to what I was talking about, the autism, does not necessarily mean that if you fix this, you will fix that. So always, it's amazing science, but the way I like to say is, in microbiome science, we're like cancer research was in the 60s. It's like really interesting, really exciting, but we have a lot of learning to do.
Yeah. And I think that there's some market-driven impetus to make claims that tend to be, way ahead of where the science is. And so the reason I have such respect for you and your father is because you're in the ivory tower and only kind of staying close to the evidence and just doing what works and what can be done, right? And so I think there's just a lot, it's wild, wild west out there. And so, there's been a lot of cautionary advice coming from myself and, the doctors that I've interviewed, just being like, look, don't don't just jump in. We're not there yet. It's promising, but we're not there yet.
Dead on.
Yeah, love it. And the test is super affordable. It's wonderful. It's just good to know what's going on in your body, and then recommendations on food and especially diet and lifestyle and stress reduction. One of the ironies of all this is my own journey coming full circle is having done a significant amount of work looking at the microbiome. One of the things that kind of bopped me right in the head was what you said, maybe 20 minutes ago, which is, you got to manage your stress. And it took me full circle back to like my monk days. And I'm like, holy crap, I didn't even realize how relevant all of this mind body stuff was when I was going through it as a monk, because, it was what I did. And it kind of came front and center, just being like, listen, if we can't get people to relax, they could blend up as much inulin as they want. It ain't going to work. And so there's a lot to be said around that with lifestyle. It's just managing your stress and managing your mindset.
Stress is the new poison, is the way we talk about it. It's, if you do not manage it, it will manage you, so.
Amen. Great. Well, folks, biohmhealth.com, Afif, I love talking to you every time. More to come. Just ping me as soon as some of this research comes up. And, I love these conversations. So thank you.
I really appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.